Her new memoir is called What Happened, and it is getting a lot of buzz. And joining me now is the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Secretary Clinton, great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Rita. It's great to talk with you today.
It certainly is. And boy, I can't think of a more powerful time to do this interview with you, especially given the developments in just the last few days. You talk a lot in your book about women empowerment. What is your reaction to so many of the allegations against Alabama GOP Senate nominee Roy Moore?
You know, Rita, there were a lot of reasons to be worried about him, and the people of Alabama now have more reasons to be concerned because clearly his whole past is now revealed not only with respect to these latest charges, but some of the ideas that he's promoted, some of his behaviors while sitting on the bench. Clearly he doesn't appear to be someone who will bring respect and honor to the state of Alabama. So I hope that the voters of Alabama know they've got a very strong man of integrity and proven experience to vote for instead, and that they will take that opportunity. Because what I'm worried most about right now, Rita, is that our politics is broken, and we are unfortunately seeing that firsthand on Capitol Hill with this terrible tax bill that they are trying to push through that will hurt the majority of Americans and benefit the tiniest percentage of really wealthy people. So, the folks in Alabama need somebody who will stand up for them, and I hope that's how they vote when they can.
And I definitely want to ask you about the tax bill in a moment. Do you think, given the fact that it's now 9 women who've made various allegations against Roy Moore, should he drop out of the race?
Well, I'm going to leave that to the Republican Party because they're the ones that have to deal with this. Look, we have a man who's accused of sexual assault sitting in the Oval Office, don't we? And the very credible accusations against him have not been taken seriously. So I think that the Republicans have a big problem that they're going to have to address, and it's not just confined to what's happening in Alabama.
Let me ask you about the situation as you talk about with Roy Moore, because you just said that you have a sexual assaulter in the White House. How could you say that about President Trump?
Well, based on the very credible statements that have come forward from, I think, now a dozen women, and really based on his own words. The Hollywood Access tape was not made up. He was describing sexual assault, and it was shocking. Yet people seem to think he, didn't have to be held accountable for it. And now we're, seeing other accusations against other people, but that doesn't mean that what we learned in the campaign and what we can see in terms of the people, the women who are still speaking out about their experiences with him should be overlooked or forgotten.
Now, you talk about women and that they should be believed. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, your longtime friend and political ally, said in an interview this week that your husband should have resigned after his affair with Monica Lewinsky. What do you say to that?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what she was trying to say. There has been some confusion about it. But look, this was a painful time, not only in our marriage, but in our country, as I've written about. But it was investigated fully. It was addressed at the time. He was held accountable. That is very different than what people seem to be remembering from that period, because you can go back and look at the history. But right now, this is not a distraction we should fall for. The Republicans are led by a man who admitted to sexually assaulting women. He bragged about it, and if we're going to encourage women to have the courage to be heard, we can't excuse the president from this debate. And look, the right and the Republican Party needs to answer for their own acts and tell America that what Roy Moore and the president did will not be tolerated.
But how is that different than the allegations against your husband? Because do you concede that your husband might not have lasted in office if that happened today? Well,
I don't know that we can rewrite and revise history, but look, if The Justice Department wants to assign a special counsel to investigate President Trump. That's the parallel. If they want to spend $70 million investigating every allegation that anyone might make against him, that would be in line with what happened in the 90s. So if we want to hold people accountable, that happened in the 90s, and I think that that's the parallel. If people want to look back in history and say what was done then should be done now, then they should go forward and do that.
But shouldn't they then also look at allegations against your husband and others? Because some feel that it's a double standard.
I don't think so, Rita. I mean, everything was investigated. Everything was investigated, and I think that's the big difference. So when somebody else is investigated to the tune of $70 million and a special prosecutor who wants to prosecute and a partisan Republican Party that wants to impeach, that's the parallel. And the people of the United States rejected it. The Senate rejected it. But he was held accountable, and he paid a price for it, as was appropriate.
Do you regret, though, not maybe, saying something, I guess, supportive of the women? Because you've always said that women should be believed. And yet George Stephanopoulos and others have said that you were part of sort of the attacking the victims, the people who are making allegations against your husband. Do you regret that?
Look, I think every situation has to be judged on its own merits. And there were allegations that were disproved. There were allegations that were absolutely contradicted under sworn testimony. So, of course, you should give, people who make such allegations the benefit of the doubt. That's what our system does. But then you have to investigate them, and that fully happened in the late 90s. And what we've got here is something very different. There's been no commitment to investigate the more than a dozen women who have made charges against the President Trump, and there's been no effort to really go into and understand what he was talking about in his Hollywood Access tape. So I just they are not parallel, and I think it's unfortunate that people are either misremembering or misinterpreting history, because the country remembers it. The country went through it, and it was a painful period. The Republicans spent tens of millions of dollars looking at every part of our lives, and we all know what they found. And that was, based on those allegations that were provable and the many that were not. And this is a distraction that we shouldn't fall for. Because if you're going to hold people to the same standard, there's a lot of parallels that are not being followed in recent times.
And Secretary Clinton, what would you say, though, specifically to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand? Because, she's a longtime ally, friend, and also even took your Senate seat.
Well, she has been a friend, and Bill and I have supported her over the years. We both have campaigned for her and raised money for her. Obviously, I think the history of the 90s reaches different conclusions. That's what impeachment and a trial is meant to determine what should happen, and it did determine that. And I think we ought to now look at what's happening today and learn from history where we can. And if we're going to be serious about holding people accountable, have a process to do that.
Are you surprised, though, that she has made these comments?
Oh, as I said, I don't exactly know what she was trying to say because her whole comment was somewhat contradictory, but I'll let her speak for herself.
Aren't you disappointed because even your former aide came out and blasted her and basically said she's a hypocrite because she was, received endorsements from you and support from you?
Oh, I'm not gonna comment on that. I think she has to speak for herself.
Let me ask you about Al Franken, because as you talked about with Roy Moore, of course, some pretty serious allegations, Secretary Clinton, have come out about Al Franken, allegations of sexual harassment and also sexual assault. Should he resign because he is a sitting senator?
Look, Al Franken, is a friend of mine, and I deeply regret what he did. There's no excuse for his behavior, none at all. But he's called for an investigation. He's apologized to the woman involved. Apparently she's accepted the apology. So I think we've got to, recognize that he agreed to an ethics investigation. It will go to the ethics committee. It will investigate whatever the situation was, and they'll decide about what, if any, action should be taken based on that behavior. And I think that's the appropriate process because, I think that something like that coming into the public arena and Al's very quick acceptance of responsibility and apology and his willingness to be investigated and to take the consequences is the kind of accountability I'm talking about. I don't hear that from Roy Moore or Donald Trump. Do you?
Do you agree that there should be zero tolerance for sexual harassment and sexual assault?
Absolutely. No, women have to be protected. They have to be able to work comfortably in any work setting, any kind of social setting. And, of course, there should be not only no tolerance, there should be an absolute understanding that there will be accountability. And, again, when credible allegations come forward, look at the contrast between Al Franken accepting responsibility, apologizing, and Roy Moore and Donald Trump, who have done neither.
Well, of course, President Trump has said it was locker room talk, and Al Franken is a sitting senator, and there's that picture, too, of him, which looks like that he is groping the radio host Leanne Tweeden.
Well, I don't see it the way you just described it, Rita. I think when someone admits to sexual assault and more than a dozen women come forward with very specific allegations, that's not locker room talk, and that certainly is more than what we know so far about Al Franken. So, look, there's a double standard. I get it. The Republicans deny, and divert, and they get away with it because the press is more concerned about somebody who accepted responsibility than people who will refuse to accept responsibility and instead attack the women who have made the allegations against them. And that has to stop. There should be no double standard. If you're going to hold somebody accountable, hold them accountable, and without regard to their partisan affiliation.
Let me ask you, if I could, about the uranium one, because I know you've been asked some general questions, but I just have two or three specific ones, Secretary Clinton. One is the former head of the Kazakh Atomic Energy Agency. He said that you, as senator, canceled meetings with Kazakh officials and would not meet with them until uranium assets were transferred to Frank Justra. He's the Canadian businessman. And then 2 months after those assets were transferred, the businessman donated $30 million to the Clinton Foundation. What do you say to people who say that just seems unseemly?
I don't know what he's talking about, so I can't respond to it. Let's talk about Uranium One and all of the wild accusations. Let's remember that it started out as a Steve Bannon Breitbart project that was designed to hurl false allegations against me. It got into the mainstream press because the New York Times made a deal with Breitbart, and that doesn't get enough attention. The Times, really got in bed with Breitbart and the far right, and they should hold themselves accountable for getting the story so wrong. Just a few days ago, one of the commentators on Fox News called the accusations inaccurate, did a very compelling takedown of the story based on the facts. Trey Gowdy, congressman from South Carolina, no friend of mine, and no stranger to wasting taxpayer dollars on politically motivated investigations, said that a special counsel was not warranted. So what we have here is exactly what it looks like. It's a political stunt by the Trump administration and its allies to distract from the very serious information coming out about the Trump campaign's connections with Russia. They don't want the press and the public paying attention to what we're learning about their involvement with Russia. And I wrote about this in the book. I have a whole chapter on Russia, and if any of your listeners are still scratching their heads, I hope they'll read it because, when I started out talking about the connections with Russia, a lot of people, really just dismissed them. They couldn't believe it, and I understand why. It was pretty outlandish to think that a political candidate and his campaign would be conspiring with a foreign adversary to win an election.
But was there anything, Secretary Clinton, to this allegation specifically? Was there anything to? Can you understand why people?
Rita, I don't know. Rita, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard that. I don't know anything about that. And it's part of the whole Uranium One, confusion. And so, no, I don't know anything about it. I do know that this whole thing has been investigated repeatedly, and it's been debunked repeatedly.
Can I ask you just on the surface, because one of the things that people point to is that in the Uranium One story, it troubles them that the Clinton Foundation failed to disclose it was about over $2 million in donations from the chairman of Uranium One as the deal was being reviewed, considered. Do you agree that just looks bad?
Rita, that's not true. The gentleman in question had sold his interest in Uranium One some years before. It's just not true, Rita. Now, I know that, the right does a great job of throwing up these crazy allegations, but just look at the facts. Go back and look at Shepard Smith's takedown. None of this is true. Now, that doesn't mean they won't investigate it because they're trying to divert attention from their connections with Russia. But I can assure you it's been investigated. It's been looked at by the press, by experts. Everybody has come to the same conclusion. There is no factual basis. I had nothing to do with the decision. Now, that is a fact. I had nothing to do with it. It was delegated to somebody else in the State Department, and 9 people had to agree, and they all agreed from all the different agencies in our government. And then 2 Republican governors had to agree. John Huntsman in Utah and Rick Perry in Texas. This is just a smokescreen. So, there's no facts to it, but, I can't stop the Justice Department and the White House from trying to throw sand in the eyes of people.
Let me ask you, Secretary Clinton, I know you've said a number of harsh things about President Trump. Is there anything you admire that you think he's done well as president?
No. The answer is absolutely no, Rita, and I don't say that with any joy. I respect the office. I think he has disgraced the office. I think he has behaved in a way that is not in keeping with our Constitution. He has failed to enforce laws like sanctions on Russia that the Congress overwhelmingly passed. He has used the office to enrich himself and his family and his business. I am deeply disappointed. I didn't think he'd be a good president, but I didn't think he'd be as bad as he's turned out to be.
And very quickly, how important, you brought up tax reform at the beginning, how important do you think that is to his presidency?
Well, it's important to the Republican donors, all the billionaires who support him. So it's a tax plan designed to help billionaires. And it's regrettable that it passed in the House, but I will predict to you that a number of Republican members of Congress who voted for it will lose their seats in 2018 because what they did was to vote against their constituents, to vote to cut Medicare, to vote to cut Medicaid, to vote to cut Social Security disability insurance, and to in other ways hurt people that they represent. And the Senate Republican plan has gone from bad to worse. It will implement throwback economic policies that will cut taxes for corporations and the rich while increasing them for most Americans. How do you do that? I mean, the Republicans will tell you that giving corporations a tax break creates economic growth. That's their argument. But that is not true. It hasn't been true in the past. My husband raised taxes, and we had the longest peacetime expansion in American history. But what the Republicans will do with their tax plan is dramatically increase federal deficits. And really, one of the bait-and-switch parts of this whole thing is they're giving permanent tax cuts to corporations by giving some tax cuts to the middle class, which means that people making under $75,000 a year, which is the vast majority of Americans, will actually see their taxes increase. And then to add insult to injury, the Senate Republicans would take health care coverage away from 13 million people to pay for these permanent corporate tax cuts that flow overwhelmingly to the wealthy. And, there's even talk of cutting Medicaid next year to pay for tax cuts, something that Trump said in his campaign he would never do. He would never cut Medicare. He would never cut Medicaid. Well, that's on the table right now. So this is bad policy that is downright cruel to working Americans. And I encourage people to call their senators, tell them you oppose this bill, citizen activism worked in stopping, repealing, and replacing the Affordable Care Act, and I think it can work here if people get really passionate about it.
What is ahead for you? There are some reports you may be at Columbia University as a professorship.
Rita, I haven't made any commitments yet. I want to finish my book tour. We're talking from Austin, Texas, where I am going to be doing a book signing. But I am most committed to helping new, young organizations through my new group called Onward Together get the support they need to help win elections like they did in Virginia last week. And I'm going to do everything I can to support Democrats and causes that I believe in because I think the future of the country is at stake. And I'm going to be active in the debate going forward about, how we're going to get back on track and not to have these terrible laws passed and give up on our economic and strategic and moral leadership in the world. So I write about a lot of this in my book, What Happened. I hope your listeners will find it of interest because I think everybody has a stake in it, regardless of your partisan political ideology. We can't let our country get undermined, and we can't give up on our most important values like our democracy and the rule of law.
Secretary Clinton, thank you so much for being here. Again, the book is called What Happened.
Thanks, Rita. Good to talk to you.